Good morning, everyone. It's Lee Henson, President, Founder of AgileDad, and it's time for today's episode of the Daily Stab. So without any further ado, let's get started. We've made it more than halfway through this week. Life is good. Things are moving forward. And I got a really interesting email for a request for a podcast. My good friend Tom writes in. He says, "Hi, Lee. I love your training and your podcast. Could you please give some examples on how to coach a team when you observe an anti-pattern? So, for example, at the end of each sprint, when a user story is rolling over to the next sprint, bad form already, the team is in the habit of closing the story with an estimated number of points completed and creating a new story with the remaining value points. Eeks. It seems to me that this defeats the purpose, but when I suggest otherwise, they would get defensive. Would love your take on this. So let me give you that example first, and then I'm going to tell you about a couple of tricks and tips you can do to help solve this problem. So right away with that example, this is something that I've heard for quite some time where teams get into bad form and they say, well, we at least want to take credit for the part we got done. And this is a symptom. This is actually a symptom of the team feeling slighted because things have been inserted into their sprint before or traded out without their ability to vet it first. So for example, if the team's working and they have 6 items in their sprint, right? And they're plugging along and everything's good. And somebody comes in, Tom, and says, the sky is falling. This is more important. We need this now. What ends up happening is the product owner will take a look at it and say, yep, based on what I think that's medium. And then what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, this medium one in the sprint hasn't had a lot of work done on it. Let's switch it with that one. And they'll immediately swap it with one of the mediums that was part of the team's original commitment. And what ends up happening when you do that is now the team's responsible for finishing an item that they didn't have in backlog refinement, that wasn't part of their sprint planning, but it's medium in size, so it should be an even swap, right? Not necessarily. This is why we call it relative estimation. The estimates that we give are relative, meaning that even if you swap something out that's the same number of story points, it doesn't mean it's going to require the same level of effort. And who knows if the individual who has the most capability or capacity for that matter to do the item is going to be available to work on the new item when it was assured that the person was going to be available to work on the item that you pulled out. So when this happens and the team constantly feels like they're getting their rug pulled out from under them, they feel like they're always getting slighted, that people are taking advantage of their ability to finish work, and they're scared or concerned that they want to make sure that they can get credit for the work that they finish. This is when you start to see the teams behave this way, and they start to say, I want credit for every single point. So what they'll do is they'll take items into the sprint. Now, I'm going to give you the second symptom here. Sometimes the team will take items into the sprint that are way too big. So they'll take something into the sprint knowing it's large and knowing it should be broken down, but they'll try it anyway because they'll say, we'll investigate and we'll learn as we go. And instead of taking care of the grooming or refinement in a backlog grooming session, they'll take that all the way into sprint planning and take it into the sprint and do the refinement there. And that's when they discover, oh, this is a Linux kernel, or, oh, this is much bigger than I thought it was. So then what ends up happening is they break that item down literally during a sprint, and they want to take credit for the part that they did and push out the part that's incomplete. This practice of splitting stories is poison. What ends up happening is if you get in a habit of splitting stories, then it becomes okay for you to say, you might as well create a status on your board that's called almost done, and that sounds so ridiculous. But that's basically what you're saying. You're authorizing saying it's okay to be almost done. That having a story completely finished and tested and groomed and defined and the whole 9 yards isn't as important. So what winds up happening is after a few times of splitting stories, the team feels like, oh, well, we didn't get much trouble for that, and we got credit for the work we did. Why don't we follow this anti-pattern? We'll just keep on doing it. And what ends up happening over time is it becomes normal. It becomes habit forming. It becomes the team's go-to. They say, well, at least we don't have to worry about, getting it right in planning, because we can always just break it down and do part of it during the sprint and get partial credit and get the other part later. The other thing that's bad form is that it encourages the team not to push back when work is switched or new work is introduced in the middle of a sprint. So I think the 3 keys here, Tom, is 1, we need to get in the habit of doing really good backlog refinement or grooming to make sure that the team is meeting with the product owner for at least an hour a week to sit down with them and get the backlog ready so that new introductions don't come in that are scary. Two, we need to learn how to handle in-sprint interruptions. If we learn how to handle the in-sprint interruptions, then a team doesn't end up at a point where they're taking in new work so late in the sprint and giving up other work and trading things out. And it doesn't put us in this predicament, which means we have to eliminate technical debt, which could be a whole nother podcast episode. And three, I think it's ultimately important that the team recognizes that splitting stories to take partial credit is bad form, and that it's their responsibility to commit to the work that they can complete and finish it, even if it means taking on one less story, Tom, even if it means that they're going to say, hey, instead of taking on 6 stories this sprint, I'm only going to take on 5 because this one looks kind of wiry to me. In a worst case scenario, they finish it early and they pull in another item. In a best case scenario, they took on the right amount of work and they didn't overcommit. I hope that was useful to you. And that's just one anti-pattern, for example. If you have another anti-pattern you want us to cover, if any of you have an anti-pattern you want us to cover, or you want us to discuss some of the best form, we'd love to hear your request and talk about the things that you have on a different episode of the Daily Stand-Up. Thanks again, Tom, for sending that in. Once again, if you want to send one in, send it to learnmore@agiledad.com or kim@agiledad.com, and we'd love to field those requests and get you going. As always, my friends, I love to hear your requests. I hope you have an amazing week. I hope the rest of the week goes really well for you. And I encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.